Welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to the show. Welcome to my living room. I'm no longer on holiday in Tenerife. I'm now back under house arrest in southwest London. There's a lot to discuss this week, a lot for us to pack into the next 60 minutes or so. Later on tonight's show, I'm going to be joined by Kate Andrews, the economics correspondent at the Spectator, the Money Week columnist, comedian, stand-up comedian, author, historian and polymath Dominic Frisby. We're going to be discussing, has the EU gone completely barking mad in sort of banning the AstraZeneca vaccine? Is the banning of the Oxford vaccine just the latest deadly action caused by the overzealous use of the so-called precautionary principle? That will be coming up later in tonight's show. We're also going to be looking a little bit at the dog that hasn't yet barked. What can we expect from the future of the economy, especially when it comes to inflation? Where's it been? Why hasn't it been there? We've had a total ton of quantitative easing and money printing since 2008. Why haven't we seen inflation? And if it comes, what are we going to do about it? But before all that, pleased to welcome my very first guests. Steve Baker, the Conservative MP for Wycombe, freedom fighter, wrangler of the people on the Conservative benches who are freedom fighters as well. Steve, a very good evening to you. Lovely to have you with us.
Good evening, Mark. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thanks for having me on.
And a warm welcome back to the programme to Calvin Robinson, commentator, freedom fighter, senior fellow at Policy Exchange. Good evening, Calvin. How are you keeping?
I'm fantastic. It's a pleasure to be back. Good
to have you both. So I'm going to start on a sort of civil liberties point, really, a freedom point rather than an economics point. I often have to remind people, although we're called the Institute of Economic Affairs and we principally talk about economics, our mission statement is also to promote the fundamental institutions of a free society. So first up, I'm keen to chat about this new police crime sentencing and courts bill that's passed in the Commons. Is the government, we're asking, trying to create an authoritarian police state? I say we're asking. That's actually the assertion made by our good friends in Extinction Rebellion, not an organisation that's typically prone to understatement. But this enormous bill covers everything, from stricter sentences for sex offenders and child murderers to powers to stop protesters. Currently, if the police want to place restrictions on a protest, they have to show that it might result in serious public disorder, property or human damage. The bill changes this so the police can impose start and finish times, set noise limits, apply these rules to the demonstration potentially of just one person. So if an individual's holding a protest placard and blasting out their views on some megaphone, they could be fined. They could be fined £2,500. Stop Brexit! He would have gone bankrupt pretty fast, that guy on College Green, I guess. Other changes mean damaging memorials could lead to 10 years in prison. That's potentially twice the sentence of trading firearms and 5 times longer than racially aggravated common assault. Sounds on the face of it, bit of an assault on our civil liberties, Steve. What do you make of it? In the Telegraph, you said the bill is, quote, necessary to deal with radical new tactics by political protesters, especially XR-style activism. You've become an authoritarian, Steve. Are you even a libertarian anymore?
Well, of course, am I a libertarian is, of course, what they're asking on the pages of the great Bucks Free Press, our local newspaper. No, look, the reality is, as anyone on here who believes in a free society knows, freedom has proper limits, and those limits are when you start impinging on other people. So, of course, I believe people should be free to protest. And I said that in relation to the Everard vigil. You know, that vigil, apart from coronavirus, would never have, I would hope, never have come to the attention of the police and should have been able to go ahead without without any problems, and people should be free to protest. But people will remember that Extinction Rebellion obstructed ambulances. There's a video of Tom Harwood's been put back out, showing an ambulance struggling to get across the bridge to the hospital. It wasn't the only time it happened. They ground our capital city to a halt, camping out on the roads. Most of the people involved with Extinction Rebellion, I don't doubt, are lovely, moderate people who care about the climate. But if you look at, I'm glad we've got Calvin on the call, because if you look at Policy Exchange's paper, a rather directly called Extremism Rebellion, they catalogue what is going on at the heart of XR. The paper sets out in some detail how they intend to use mass premeditated non-violent law breaking to try and get their way outside the democratic system for a radical transformation of our system of society, which is anti-capitalist, collectivist and radical. And I'm afraid if they're going to engage in mass non-violent law breaking to try and bring the criminal justice system to its knees, I'm afraid in a free society you have to say, no, we're not going to take that.
Okay, I'll come to Calvin in a minute. Be interested to hear more about this Policy Exchange paper. But Steve, let me just press you a bit on this, because back in a previous life, I was the campaigns director of the human rights group Liberty. And so I'm familiar with these sort of debates when these police crime and sentencing bills come around. But my problem is this. Surely it's already illegal to prevent an ambulance getting to a hospital or, blocking the road without a permit or whatever. Isn't there the danger that politicians keep bringing forward new laws? I mean, just enforce the old laws. The most absurd example I remember was a specific law was passed, I believe it was under the Blair government, making it illegal to set off a nuclear explosive device in a populated area, as if that wasn't, as if you could get away with that previously. These things that you've highlighted, Steve, isn't it a problem of enforcement rather than what the law of the land actually is?
Well, conceivably, it has been a problem of enforcement, and I'm not going to claim that, I tend to follow other issues rather than home affairs and criminal justice, but so I'm not going to pretend to be the first expert on it. But nevertheless, the government's brought the bill forward. Now we've got to consider it. But I think it was right to support the bill at second reading. Now it goes into committee stage. People have been talking about the bill as if it's been rushed through because there was only, I think, 6 days between publication and second reading. But the reality is it's now going to go into committee stage, coming back to the House. I think the committee stage is due to finish 24th of June, if I remember correctly. That is plenty of time for all interested parties to suggest amendments. And as I said in a joint article with Dominic Grieve, I'm very well prepared to look at amendments at report stage if I'm not on the committee. Of course I am. But, I think my constituents would expect me to be a conservative. And that means saying that, yes, the right freedom to protest, but no, you cannot go too far. But of course, you're right about the need to enforce the laws we've got. But I would just say it's not that long ago where I was the only voice in the House of Commons standing up and saying Extinction Rebellion is not something to which the front benches should be cuddling up, and pointing out the things I've said already. So, I'm afraid both front benches were getting very cozy with XR, and I don't think that's appropriate. I'm sorry.
Calvin, let me come to you. We rather provocatively put up on the YouTube screen this Extinction Rebellion assertion that the government's deliberately creating an authoritarian police state. But you're somebody who is a regular commentator on our airwaves, standing up for freedoms. What do you make of this latest police crime and sentencing bill? A proportionate response to a different and new criminal target, or something that's draconian?
Well, in answer to the direct question, are the government creating an authoritarian police state? I would say no, because we're already living in one, unfortunately. The government has a say in where I'm allowed to go outside of my home. The government has a say in who I'm allowed to invite into my house. And I get there's a pandemic on and we have to address these issues with different measures than we've ever used before, but it is authoritarian. So we are living in that police state at the moment. But this paper, this policy exchange paper that has been mentioned, the idea was that the Crown Prosecution Service should prosecute lawbreakers at these law-breaking demonstrations. So it was, like you say, it was putting into action legislation that's already in place and recognizing that these far left extremists are extremists. Extinction Rebellion, I would call them domestic terrorists for what they do. You know, they block the free press, they block ambulances, they put people's lives at risk. And we need to start recognizing that. Just because they're from the far left doesn't mean they're any less dangerous than terrorist organizations or groups from the far right. And I think what we've got at the moment is a two-tier, or many people think or perceive it to be a two-tier policing system, in that if you're for a woke cause like Black Lives Matter, the police will just take a knee to you. Whereas if you're protesting against lockdowns, they'll get a tougher stance. And that doesn't seem appropriate. That doesn't seem right or fair. And in this country, we care about what's fair, not just our freedoms.
But again, Calvin, let me put the same sort of question to you that I put to Steve. If the police are exercising their discretion wrongly in that fashion, you know, we're going to break up these sort of protests because those are nasty people. We're not going to break up identical protests because we approve of the cause. I mean, that's an administrative failure of the police rather than something that requires us to change, you know, legal sentences or change it. I mean, what do you think, for example, of this, 10-year sentence for vandalizing a statue? I mean, again, I would have thought that's covered by criminal damage, and it might be an exacerbating feature at sentencing if you've caused criminal damage to a well-respected national memorial. But aren't we just sort of aren't these laws basically becoming virtue signals? If there's a problem with the police properly policing protests, have a word with Cressida Dick and others and say, you've got to get your house in order. You don't need legislation for that, do you?
Yes and no. So I do believe there's legislation that covers a lot of that stuff. But there are also some good things in this bill. It's not a terrible bill, the Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Bill. For example, you can now stop the automatic early release of offenders who pose a danger to the public. That is a new good piece of legislation there. Life sentences for killer drivers. There are a lot of different tougher sentencing parts of this bill that I fully support. What I don't support is this idea of tackling non-violent protests. We should never, ever, ever, ever prevent non-violent protests in this country. That is how we know we are a free country. And the moment we take that away, that's another freedom that's gone. It's now becoming illegal to protest against anti-protest laws. That's baffling that we're at that point. And the wording around it, intentionally or recklessly causing public nuisance. I cause a public nuisance every time I speak. I don't think that should be a criminal.
That's your job. Your job's to cause a public nuisance. That's what you pay the big bucks for. Yeah.
I don't know about that, but I cause annoyance. I cause inconvenience, and these are words that are used in this bill, and that I find very, very troubling.
Well, can I just reply to that? Because I'm inclined to find it troubling, and I've got misgivings about the bill, and particularly bringing into statute the public nuisance common law provisions has created things like the serious annoyance provision, and the government's going to have to work very hard to justify leaving that in. But if somebody in a non-violent way deliberately obstructs all the roads around Westminster so that members of Parliament can't get to Parliament to do their democratic duty, which I hope it won't be considered too self-centred to say, I think is quite important. And more important even than that, obstruct newspapers from being printed, which you referred to yourself, and still more important, obstructing ambulances from getting to hospitals. I'm afraid if somebody's intentionally and recklessly doing those things, that has got to be dealt with, and my constituents would expect me to vote for it, because it could be my voters who are losing loved ones because an ambulance didn't get through, and we can't have it.
Sure. Steve, I should ask you what you made of the Clapham Common Vigil incident, protest breaking up thereof. You referenced it in your opening remarks. I think one of your colleagues, wasn't it, Charles Walker, said that, this, you couldn't really blame the police. It's Parliament that's passed the law. If you've passed a law to say that people have got to socially distance and the official protest didn't go ahead, don't you need the police to arrest people? I mean, I haven't seen all the footage. I don't know if they were heavy-handed, but aren't the police in danger of taking a rap here for a decision made by Parliament?
I agree with Cressida Dick that the police were placed in an invidious position by the coronavirus legislation, which is, by the way, ambiguous. Big Brother Watch explained this very well in their brief, that in the Tier 4 legislation, the exemption for protest from stay-at-home is removed, but there is still a common law right to silent protest which subsists. So it can, there's various other arguments, but it can be argued that the right to protest continues. So the police certainly were put in an invidious position, particularly at this stage of the pandemic and the vaccine rollout. but bear in mind that there is a degree of discretion, and I think it's very important not to be too hard on police officers who have to make difficult decisions, which I've never had to make. But I think in all of the circumstances prevailing, and people don't need me to catalogue them, it's difficult to see how it was a very wise decision to remove those protesters who were outside, when we know that outside it's quite difficult to transmit the virus. So it's all extremely unfortunate, but I agree with you. The prime responsibility is with government. And I and Dominic Grieve together said government should immediately move to make protest unequivocally lawful again, whatever the words were in the article.
Calvin, what's your take on that? Are the police in an impossible position? I mean, if you see them breaking up protests and all of it, it's not really the fault of the coppers, is it? It's the fault of Parliament for, inviting them, indeed demanding that they behave in such a fashion.
Sure, but we have established that they have discretion here, and I don't think they've used it appropriately. And we've seen over the last year, we've probably had more protests and riots than we've had in a long time. And the way that the police has responded to different causes has affected people's perception of the police now. There's no longer an acceptance that the police are part of the community. There's an us versus them attitude that's building up. And I think a lot of this comes down to the responsibility of Cressida Dick, and I think she should shoulder a lot of blame for this.
Well, let's welcome to get our thoughts on this before we move on to the topic of vaccines and precaution and what's going on in the EU at the moment. Let's welcome Kate Andrews to the show, formerly of our parish at the IEA, our former Director of Communications, media superstar, now economics correspondent at the Spectator. Kate, great to have you back on the programme. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope we've managed to switch you in and put your microphone on. Good evening to you. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right. As fine as you can be in these strange times. Thanks for having me.
In these very, very strange times. So let me just get your thoughts quickly on this policing situation. Where are you on the, like Steve, are you even a libertarian anymore? or do you think these new powers have gone too far? And what do you make of the fact that you can now get a longer prison sentence for assaulting a statue of a dead man than you can of assaulting an actual living woman?
Yeah, I think many issues with this policing bill that is going through the Commons at the moment, should have been flagged by small L liberals in the Conservative Party, in the Labour Party, before it got to the stage, before the tragic death of a young woman made people realize exactly what was in it. And I think what's going to be particularly difficult for the government come the end of March is that voting to renew the Coronavirus Act is to renew what we now see can be an excuse, really, or at least an opportunity for police to use as cover this legislation. Now, I was listening to Steve's points before, and I think he makes a very good one, that in many ways, the police are just doing what this act told them to do. But there are still major questions around the discretion that they did or did not decide to use. So I don't think that you can say that they're completely without blame here. But politicians have to take a lot of this blame. And renewing the Coronavirus Act in its full form for another 6 months now, I think, seems particularly excessive when you're looking at infection rates, hospitalization rates, and death rates of this virus, with, as we learned tonight, nearly half of all adults in the UK having gotten at least their first jab. It seems really excessive to me. So I would be really surprised if you didn't have pushback on at least only renewing parts of the Coronavirus Act as opposed to all of it.
Can I just be really boring and tedious as a legislator?
Yeah, that's your job. That's what they pay you the big bucks for, Steve.
Yeah, the huge bucks, yeah. If people go to legislation.gov.uk, you can have a look at which bits of law do what. But the Coronavirus Act isn't the act that's been used to bring in the lockdown and the bans on protest and so on. That's done on under the Public Health Act 1984, appropriately. The Coronavirus Act deals with other matters. So, yeah, Kate's absolutely right. The Coronavirus Act is coming up for renewal. But actually, it's the Public Health Act 1984 that provides for lockdown. And we need a new Public Health Act, because what the Public Health Act 84 does has enabled the government to use absolutely draconian powers, but without the kind of scrutiny which the Civil Contingencies Act foresaw. So what we need to do is, as I've published the paper now, Lord Sumption was good enough to help with the outline of an act, which I've put on my Twitter feed, outline of a bill rather, but we do need a new Public Health Act, and it needs to make provision for proper cost-benefit analysis. I think it should be lifelong well-being adjusted life years, and we should have routine, regular opportunities to say no to these lockdown powers.
Yeah. Okay. Just before I move on to what we're calling the risk principle, Calvin, you mentioned that on the policing, I'd like all of your thoughts on this, that there's now more of a kind of them and us feel about it, that there might be people who see the Metropolitan Police in London as the enemy rather than their protectors. Do you think that what we're likely to witness as people get more and more frustrated with the lockdown, especially if deaths and infections and hospitalizations fall, that we will see more and more flouting of the law? I mean, there are very different issues here. The vigil for Sarah Everard and fans of Rangers Football Club celebrating in Glasgow city centre because they won the league for the first time in 10 years. But do you think people will find more and more reasons, whether they're flippant reasons about football or somber reasons about the murder of a young woman, to start breaking the law, and the rule of law might start just coming into disrepute? It will be even more them and us, as the police are put in an ever more impossible position because the broad compliance of the British population perhaps is coming to an end. What do you think, Calvin?
Absolutely. So we're seeing this already. I was on Oxford Street the other day, and it was almost like a normal weekday. People are out and about doing what they need to do. And there is some element of disregard for these laws because people are getting sick and tired of them, or they've been under lockdown for too long and they're just getting on with their lives. But what I worry about is that might change our relationship with the law. As in, once we've started to disregard certain laws, we can get into the mentality of picking and choosing which laws we obey. And that's not what our country has been founded on. That's not usually the way we think about the law. So that's what concerns me going forward.
Kate, what do you think? I mean, there will be, I'm sure, illegal riotous celebrations on the streets of Southampton this coming Saturday, if we somehow get past Bournemouth and into the FA Cup semi-final, the very peak of Southampton's likely football achievements this season. Are more and more people just going to find reasons to flout the law, and it's not possible to police a civilian population who aren't willing to play ball, basically? What do you think is going to happen there?
Like the first lockdown, we see the public is moving faster than the rules. If you have been out for a walk or a run in the past month, I'd say people have been gathering outside together in relatively small groups, but certainly enjoying each other's company, not meeting up one-on-one to exercise weeks before they're legally supposed to do so. I don't think this necessarily presents a problem to a government that really plans to have us out of this by the 21st of June. It would present major issues if lockdown is going to linger, elements are going to linger for some time. It is frustrating, given all the data that we've had about COVID almost from the start of this, from last spring, and the fact that we know that it's very, very difficult for the virus to transmit outside, that we continue to act as if all gatherings or all social activity or all economic activity is created dangerously equal. It's just not. And I think the public in many ways have clocked on to that. But I don't see this being the biggest problem in the world, given that we're hopefully moving in a more positive direction on the roadmap. And then just really quickly to Steve's point about the Coronavirus Act, I think the difficult thing here is that the police are citing COVID legislation as the reason that they're acting in the way that they did this past weekend, as the reason that they're handing out COVID fines. And I think it is that cover that's the problem. I mean, we can dig into the technicalities of it, but if that act is renewed as is in full for another 6 months, I would not be terribly surprised if we continue to see overreach or police thinking they didn't need to use their discretion when they really should be, because it's there, because it's easy. I mean, this is what we all know as small L liberals, that once that cover is there, unfortunately, people will use it. So I think that's going to be the really big question in the next few weeks.
Steve, your final thoughts on this. You gave an absolutely fantastic speech at the time that the coronavirus bill passed. You could see the pain that you had as a legislator and a supporter of freedom in you having to think about the emergency. What's your present take there on unwinding this? Do we just have to accept that the government's going to be ploddingly cautious, or is there a chance of accelerating this if the public health emergency continues to diminish on the trajectory that it is? Or are we going to get preposterous things? Am I right, in Scotland they're going to reopen the pubs, but you can't serve alcohol? I saw somebody else suggesting that perhaps Nicola Sturgeon should reopen the swimming pools, but they couldn't have water in them. I mean, are we going to have this incredibly elongated move back to freedom, or could we actually put our foot on the accelerator?
Well, I make 2 points in response to that. The first is there's no sign the government's going to put their foot on the accelerator. They're sticking to these review dates, at which point they'll look at the data. So I'm afraid it's data and dates. But we battle on. But, I would say that, it's quite clear there aren't the numbers in Parliament to force the government's hand. They don't have to worry about winning any votes. The opposition is not opposing. The SNP is not opposing. Liberal Democrats have given up fighting for liberty. So I'm afraid there is a hardy group of Conservative MPs who I, again, coordinate with Mark Harper, who will keep asking the questions. We're trying to be reasonable and listen to the arguments the government's making. But we're certainly not going to be in a position as, you can't force the government's hand when they have this majority and the support of the opposition. The second point I'd make is the government's going to have to own these regulations at Easter. Because either the government leaves these regulations in place, in which case the Prime Minister will have to tell the public to obey them and instruct the police, but remind the police that the law is in place and needs to be enforced. And that, by the way, might mean arresting people going up the M6 with a full car and a roof box on. Or they need to relax the rules because they accept that the data has changed. But what we can't have, which is a point Calvin very wisely pointed to, what we can't have is the law in place, people breaking it and everyone turning a blind eye, because the rule of law is foundational to a free society. And I said months and months and months ago that the coronavirus crisis was threatening the rule of law. It's not good enough and we need to do better.
Okay. Well, let's move on to, I've been promising to move on to away from criminal justice and on to the precautionary principle, or the risk principle. The risk principle. So let's move from Britain to Europe. So the decision by France, Germany, Italy, Ireland, and 6 other nations, we'll show you which those are on the YouTube screen, to stop using the AstraZeneca vaccine follows a small number of people being affected by blood clots. Doesn't this decision, which on the face of it, I'm not a medic, but on the face of it looks crazy to me, show how lucky we are to have escaped the regulatory orbit of the European Union? Although it is fair to say the European Medicines Agency and the World Health Organization say there's no evidence of a connection. In the UK, about 165 people suffer from a blood clot every day. Scientists have worked out that the number of reports from blood clots following the ongoing vaccine program in the UK and the EU, which includes more than 20 million vaccinated to date, is just 37. By chance alone, at least 15,000 such events might have been expected from a population that size. Kate, let me start with you. I mean, does this not show that the absolute over-application of the precautionary principle that isn't actually being cautious, it's going to slow down the vaccine rollout program and cost lives, possibly measured in thousands of extra deaths and billions in economic damage?
Yeah, it certainly does. I think you've summed it up well there. Unfortunately, I think that there are elements of political choices being made here too, which makes the situation even more grim. On this point about blood clots, at the moment, there is no established connection between taking the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and being more likely to develop a blood clot. And as you said, Mark, actually to defend the EU a little bit, which usually I'm loath to do, I think the EU has a lot of responsibility for the narrative that's been crafted in Europe around this particular vaccine. But in this case, the European Medicines Agency continues to approve it for all adult age groups. It is encouraging countries to continue to use the vaccine. It is individual countries that have decided to pause. But that said, Ursula von der Leyen has made really quite, well, perhaps coy, but perhaps not remarks in the past, raising questions around the safety standards that have been implemented in the UK to speed up the process of getting a vaccine. You've had leaders from the European Union's major countries, including France, casting doubt on this vaccine. So it's not to say that the EU isn't implicated in what I think is actually much bigger narrative than the most recent development around this vaccine. But it could end up being truly tragic. I mean, you've got the European Medicines Agency, you've got the World Health Organization. Of course, you have the regulator here in the UK saying that we just don't have evidence for these claims that are being made. It does look like several of these European countries are going to hopefully pick up using the vaccine again. The question is, how much will they have undermined confidence in it in their own countries? I mean, that would be truly devastating if people who could have access to the vaccine, potentially save their life, decided not to get it.
Calvin, what's your take on this? What's going through the minds of European leaders? You could sort of understand it if the European Medicines Agency or the World Health Organization were giving unbelievably cautious guidance, but they seem as puzzled as I am. Why hit the pause button here? What on earth are they thinking? Can you explain that to me, Calvin?
Call me a cynic, but I think they're playing politics here. They've made a few mistakes along the way, and they're trying to back up the decisions that they've made. And I think that the EU is, playing politics with people's lives at this point. We said all along that they were a protection racket, and they've proven us right. People said that we wouldn't get access to the vaccine unless we were in the EU bloc, and thank God we weren't, because we've done so well as a country. And my point remains that if people don't like what Ursula von der Leyen is doing, they should vote for someone else next time. But of course they can't. There lies the problem. and there lies why we left the European Union in the first place.
Steve, what's your take on this? You were obviously a staunch Brexiteer to get our freedoms back. Is this vaccine incident, which obviously didn't feature in the referendum campaign, right? Nobody had conceived that this would be an international emergency. Is this proof positive of the benefits of Brexit, that we've had a lighter regulatory touch compared to the kind of lumbering EU, or is it basically accident? We could just as well have messed it up ourselves. It's not as if we have a lean, mean bureaucracy when it comes to, cutting through red tape. Or is this triumphant proof of what you've campaigned for all your political life, Steve, that out of the EU we would be much better off?
Well, I'm very reluctant to be triumphant because, of course, people's lives are at risk all round and people are suffering in the EU. But yeah, of course, it is a demonstration that the UK outside the EU can be more agile, and I would say more agile rather than more light touch. And to give him his due, Dominic Cummings forecast this at the beginning of the referendum campaign. He gave a wonderful interview to The Economist magazine, of all people, in which he forecast just this. And in fact, on the Vote Leave website, this was where we began in the campaign. And I loved it at the time, talking about science and markets and progress coming through trial and error, and that a multinational bureaucracy is incapable of the agility necessary in an era of accelerating complexity and change. All that good stuff, which the IEA will recognise as great arguments for freedom, free markets, and scientific progress with great error correction mechanisms. All of that, Dominic set that out at the beginning of the campaign, and he has been proven right on this point. So yes, it is one of the benefits. I'm given to understand from ministers that the success of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency in the UK has been a real boost to their confidence. Back when I was a Brexit minister, everybody was terrified that leaving the EMA would be a disaster. But it turns out we do have the expertise to do it right. And I'm absolutely confident that we do have the expertise in chemicals regulation, in civil aviation, and right across the board. We can be fantastic common law-based regulators who can deliver the agility that we need to make real progress. And I think this is one illustration, but I'm still trying to say that with a degree of humility and in a spirit of reconciliation. But we have actually got to move on and take some credit where it's due. We've done a good thing here.
Calvin, before I let you go, let me come back to you. You won't be able to see this, but our YouTube viewers will. We'll put up on the screen a chart. I love these charts. It's very rare that you see a chart with the United Kingdom streets ahead of, France, Germany, or Italy. It's usually a cluster, or often graphics are used to show that the UK, doesn't have the same level of productivity or living standards. But we're streets ahead in the vaccination programme. Slight rider there. Breaking news just before we came on air. There are some concerns that supply might slow down, I think, in about a month's time. But we're getting towards having vaccinated half of the population. This is a staggering triumph, isn't it, Calvin? But has it led to this kind of little EU mentality that we've now heard from Ursula von der Leyen? We might not allow exports to those countries who are ahead of us. I don't care if you sign the contract. Has it led to the EU turning in on itself?
It has indeed. And I wish I had the humility of Steve, because I think this is fantastic. We should celebrate the success of Great Britain in getting most of our vulnerable people vaccinated. I hope that our freedoms will be released in as quick a time as it took to vaccinate the people. And yes, we're seeing the EU implode as a result. They are livid that we're doing so well, and it's sad to see. I hope that they manage to get their act together and sort out their populations too. But we should absolutely celebrate the success of Britain in this vaccine process. And it's one of our government's biggest achievements over the lockdown period.
Calvin, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks for that highly optimistic, upbeat, celebratory note. Stay safe, stay free. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks, Calvin, very much for joining us. Kate and Steve, please stay with us. I want to bring in another friend of the show, Dominic Frisby, journalist, author, musician, comedian, all-round polymath. Able to sit at a 90-degree angle in his living room, and particularly can defy the law of gravity. Brilliant. Also the author of this brilliant book, Daylight Robbery, about taxation, how tax shaped our past and will change our future. Highly commend that to you if you haven't read it. You can see Dominic's got the promotional poster on the wall. I can say that this book has been endorsed by some really serious people. Looking at the back cover, the first endorsement, Frisby's historical interpretation and utopian ideas will outrage left and right. That quote was from Steve Baker, the Member of Parliament for Wycombe. Yeah. And a little below it, in this spectacular gallop through history, Frisby shows how taxation has warped, stunted and thwarted human progress. That's a quote from some geezer called Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. So that book comes commended by two of the guests. How are you keeping, Dominic? Are you well?
I'm very well, thanks, Mark. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad at all. I'm going to move on to inflation shortly, but Dominic, what's your take? Have you had your jab yet, Dominic? Have you qualified yet?
No, I haven't qualified. I'm 51, so I would have thought I should have qualified, but I haven't heard from anyone, and so I'm sort of patiently waiting. But I'm still not. I'm not like really anxiously pushing for it, because I'm pretty sure I must have had the disease at some point, or the infection, the virus. I don't even know what it is, but I've had it at some point. So I think I'm probably one of the more immune ones.
You're right anyway.
Yeah.
I've been phoned up several times to go and get my my jab. Just I know I look way over the age of 50, but I'm actually only 48. But because I'm asthmatic, I qualify for it. But obviously, I've been in Tenerife, so I haven't been able to have it yet.
I'm asthmatic as well. I would have thought I qualified. But anyway.
Absolutely. Come on, you're supposed to be one of these sharp-elbowed middle-class people who get the most out of the system, Dominic. This is.
No, I'm being very laissez-faire about it, Mark.
The only problem I've got is on the text, the link that they keep sending me. You can only book 3 days in advance or 4 days in advance. I can't book it in 10 days in advance. And having just got back from a foreign country, I'm under house arrest for another 10 days or so. So, but hopefully I'll be able to get the jab then. Dominic, are you celebrating the death of the precautionary principle in the UK? Is that what Brexit has brought us? You are a devout Brexiteer?
I was a devout Brexiteer, and by the death of the precautionary principle, you mean the fact that we've thrown caution to the wind and haven't taken 10 years to develop the vaccine, and we've got it in place now? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of. It's funny. I've sort of stayed out of the whole COVID thing, and I do see that it's been the great sort of living example of why Brexit was the right thing to do, but I'm not entirely convinced about other government policies in relation to COVID. And I sort of, part of me thinks that the aggregation of 63 million individual decisions would have probably resulted in a better outcome than the decisions made by HQ. So I'm sort of staying out of that particular argument, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. You think it's just, we're only doing relatively better, you think. Kate, what about you? You've been covering, you've covered, the various ways that different countries have responded to coronavirus across the continent. Has Britain taken a more liberal approach in some ways, in all ways? I mean, we're sort of celebrating the vaccine rollout program now, but our overall death rate is pretty grim overall. And at the start of this process, PPE was, not getting to where it was supposed to get to. Mixed picture, isn't it?
It's a very mixed picture. The UK, in a forthcoming inquiry, which we know is going to take place, is going to have a lot to answer for when it comes to its death toll, its economic contraction, the PPE scandals, and the rest of it. But where I think it's in a very good position is that a lot of people are going to remember the last phase, and we can only hope that the vaccination process is that last phase. And there, the UK isn't just a European leader, it's a world leader. It's having a hugely successful vaccine rollout so far. I think what is uncomfortable and a bit preemptive is the idea that we are celebrating. The government appears to be putting out a video patting itself on the back for its vaccine success story, when we're still set for months of lockdown. At the moment, the UK has one of the strictest lockdowns in the developed world, certainly in the OECD, and it's really struggling to recover its economy because of that. So we're definitely not always taking the most liberal approach. It really depends on how you look at it. There is a lot to be said, though, in proving that we have a nimble regulator, and Steve was speaking to that, and I think that's really important. The one thing I would say, and this is certainly not in defense of the countries that have paused the vaccine, but tonight, Jonathan Van Tam in the press conference started listing out the symptoms that you can get from taking paracetamol. And they're very rare and they very rarely happen, but they don't sound very nice. And the point he was making is that there are symptoms that can go along with all kinds of medicine. Doesn't necessarily mean we're scared of it. It's really important that as we learn more about these vaccines, we continue to be honest with the public. At the moment, there's not a connection between blood clots and a vaccine, this vaccine. If it were to emerge and it were very rare, we should be honest about that. And my suspicion is that this country is so keen to take the vaccine, it probably wouldn't change hearts and minds. But as long as we're honest and continue to have an honest conversation with the public, hopefully this will continue to go well. So again, not in defense of countries that have paused it, but just a reminder that we do need to be honest about trade-offs. Lockdown has been a trade-off. All of this has been a trade-off. But the vaccines are, they have so much more good behind them than bad that it is absolutely worth taking them.
Steve, I referenced your brilliant speech in Parliament, your agonised speech at the time that the coronavirus restrictions were passing. I mean, you could see your liberal soul, really echoing through the parliamentary chamber. It was a fantastic speech. But I wonder if you could share your reflections, and of course it's too early to say, about whether you think the lessons and the experience of this ghastly year that we've had will tend to push us in a more liberal direction. For sake of argument, you might say, we fast-tracked this vaccine for COVID. Should we take a more liberalised approach to fast-tracking, cancer treatments or cutting-edge treatments for Alzheimer's or whatever else might be on the shelf, which would otherwise take years? Might there be lessons that we learned that liberalise? Or do you fear that having sort of got a taste for it now, it's going to be sort of compulsory face masks and closing the pubs whenever there's a flu outbreak?
Well, I'm afraid it's a choice, Mark, and it's a choice that politicians have got to take, and we've got to decide what we believe in and what we stand for. I'm very conscious, and have been throughout this year, that I am aware of my own tendency to stand on principle. And I'm also aware that Mises and Hayek were utilitarians. I suspect that Mises would have supported restrictive measures on utilitarian grounds. I think Hayek too also spoke about the need for public health measures. So I imagine, who knows what they would have done, but I imagine that both of them would have been, realistic about the need to take some measures. But what I would say is there's got to be a conversation to be had about the most restrictive non-pharmaceutical interventions and whether they were worth the harm they did for the benefit they gave. And the reason I say that is, no, I'm not going to claim expertise. I have taken the trouble to read about 36 papers on this subject. No doubt there are dozens and dozens more papers, but at the very, very least, I think we can draw the moderate conclusion, compare Florida to California, for example, that not all of the most restrictive non-pharmaceutical interventions were worth the horrific cost across a wide range of areas which we've had to bear. So I had a conversation on video rather like this one with Professor Paul Dolan of the LSE. He is extremely good. He gave me a checklist of 20 things the government ought to be considering about the costs and benefits of lockdown. And we agreed with one another the government should have some idea of the lifelong well-being cost and benefit of the measures that it takes. And I believe those should be embodied in a new Public Health Act. But in terms of where we go next, it's a choice. And I'm really rather worried that if the government is led by focus groups and polling, it will choose authoritarianism. The government deliberately took a choice to increase people's personal sense of personal threat. That's well known. having deliberately stoked up people's fear, of course they're afraid. Mm-hmm. But now it's a decision that the Prime Minister's got to take, and ministers. What do we believe in? And if we believe in freedom, then we will go in a liberal direction from here. And I believe Boris Johnson actually does believe in freedom. Perhaps not particularly philosophically, but he certainly does believe in freedom. And it's a choice. So think tanks like the IEA and others are going to be super important. We're going to come on to inflation in a bit, but I'm conscious I've already given you a long answer. But I've got some strong views about the size of the state and inflation when we get there.
I just want to pick up with Dominic and Kate on your assertion. I was going to say Steve's a very loyal Conservative backbencher. It's probably just fair to say he's a Conservative backbencher.
Mark, I try, Mark. I try. I was very loyal while I was a minister.
Dominic, do you think Boris Johnson believes in freedom? And then I'll get Kate's take on that.
I think he believes in his own freedom. The one of the golden rules of daylight robbery, as we know, was that taxation and government controls tend to increase in a time of crisis. And after the time of crisis has passed, they never go back to the level they were before the crisis began. And this might be, the Revenue Act of 1942 in the US that gave income tax to every man in the United States for the first time after the World War II has passed. Income tax for every man never disappeared. It might be quantitative easing in the financial crisis of 2008. 2009. After the crisis has passed, quantitative easing just became normalized. And I'm afraid that with COVID, the latest crisis that we've seen a huge overreach of government. And even though that might recede a little bit after the crisis is past, I don't think it's ever going to go back to where we were before. I think, for example, the wearing of masks on public transport is going to be a permanent thing now. And that's just one tiny feature of something bigger. And that makes me very sad. And I think in a healthy society, I think this is going to be really simplistic, but I think you have two types of personality. You have the sort of gung-ho entrepreneurial types who throw out the precautionary principle as you see it. They throw it out the window and they learn how to do whatever they're doing on the job, and they wing it a little bit. And that's how you invent new things, you explore new boundaries, and frontiers get pushed. And then you have the sort of types who tells you why you can't do something, why this is not possible. And I guess in a healthy society, you need a bit of both. One to explore things and push new boundaries, and the other to rein it in. But with government now seemingly controlled by public health, that second personality type is dominating decision making at the moment, because the gung-ho types weren't feeling quite gung-ho in the face of a pandemic that they didn't fully understand. And we need to wrest back control a bit towards the gung-ho, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me we're going to permanently be a nation divided between Remainers and Leavers, right? The first division was over Brexit, but we're now still divided between Remainers and Leavers, those who want to remain at home and those who want to leave the house. It's probably pretty much the same cohorts, actually.
Yeah, I never realised leaving the house was particularly gung-ho. But
very gung-ho, living, as they say, if you're not living life on the edge, you're taking up too much room. Kate, I suspect you might be a little more sympathetic to Boris Johnson, not necessarily in terms of what he's done, but where you think his instincts lie, that he wants freedom back. He just hasn't found a way to get there. Have I summarised your views fairly there or not?
I suppose slightly more sympathetic. I think Boris Johnson very much believes in social freedom. On economic freedom, I think he can talk the talk. He understands that a successful private sector will allow him to spend more money and do big infrastructure projects in the public sector. And he likes that. So, I think he knows how to talk the free market talk, but it's not always obvious that his actions that he follows up with are particularly pro-free market. But I think he's been terrified by what's happened in the UK over the past year, by our very high excess death rate. It is scary. It's a terrifying figure. It's understood, and when this all comes out in inquiry, that probably different choices could have been made. Now, you're going to be able to say that about every government around the world, but not every government in the world has the same death toll. And I think that has really changed his thinking. And it's thought that having COVID himself and having a particularly bad time of it also changed a lot of his thinking. But frankly, public polling on this, the fact that the public really is okay with lockdown and has been for the past year and seems fine with it for the months to come, will also inevitably change a politician's calculations, for most of them anyway. Perhaps not Steve, but for most politicians, when they see that polling, they'll think, well, actually, I've got a lot more flexibility here, even if it doesn't totally line up with their philosophy or where their heart truly is. And I think there's going to have to be a real push back onto the public to take their freedoms back. My concern is that that push will have to come from politicians. And frankly, it doesn't matter about the individual politician or the party or how well-meaning everybody is. It's just very rare that politicians are desperate to give power back to the people. So I guess that's what concerns me. And these are going to be a really important few months as this roadmap is implemented, because if major COVID rules, especially around social distancing, are allowed to linger for many, many months to come, I think that could be a problem. I think we could be living with them for a long time.
I noticed somebody in the chat pointed out that my freedoms have not been curtailed quite as I advertised. I don't have to stay in my flat for 10 days. Apparently under test and release, if I took an additional test, I could get out after 5 days. But I don't really see the point of that. What am I going to do? Go and look at a pub? I mean, this doesn't seem to me.
You could have exercise, Mark. You could have a smoke outside.
I could have a smoke outside. That's true enough. Yeah, the joys that gung ho living life on the edge. Listen,
I'm worrying about your asthma and your smoking now. You've confessed to both.
Yeah. Well, the smoking. Yeah, this has probably helped me jump the queue. The smoking, Steve. Right? You can't be too careful. With a health record like mine, I should have been right at the front of the queue. I suspect. Listen, guys, I want to move on to our last topic. And we're calling this topic Inflategate. Has inflation already hit, or is it the dog that hasn't yet barked? Let's talk about inflation. It is something that could accelerate soon, considering all of the extra money that's been pumped into the economy in the last year. But a hell of a lot of money has been pumped into the economy for a very long time without at least the headline rate of inflation emerging. Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England, said there are good grounds for believing future inflation may behave very differently. Not entirely sure what he means by that or how helpful that is. However, Kate has been much more helpful. She wrote a great article on Monday. Uncertainty looms large, she says, with the Monetary Policy Committee last month projecting a 1 in 3 chance of inflation lying below zero or above 4%. So of the 745 billion, I think it is, in quantitative easing we've had since 2009, 310 billion of it has come in the last year. A report from the Bank of England in 2018 found QE made the rich richer between 2008 and 2014. This happens because it's easier to borrow to buy goods like cars, shares and houses. And institutions who receive funds from bond selling will invest in other similar assets. Property prices gone through the roof. Bitcoin's gone through the roof. I think gold is up as well. But Steve, let me ask you, you have a very good grounding and sympathy for Austrian economics. I guess my challenge to people in the Austrian school is, where is the hyperinflation we would have expected to have seen?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. I tell you what I think has happened. I think that the way that QE is done these days hides from the public the reality of what is going on. There's an old saying that you can always continue producing new money all the time the public believe you're going to stop. But because we haven't been producing paper and shoving it on wheelbarrows and into the back of lorries, people haven't understood what was happening. And of course, it's partly a psychological phenomenon. But look at what the Bank of England's actually been saying in a long session. I think it was in answer overwhelmingly this section to me, inevitably. But the bank was very clear with us that they're able to do what they're doing because of the independence of the Monetary Policy Committee. And they keep double, triple underscoring the independence of the MPC. Jan Vlega even cited that from an accounting point of view, we are in a position similar to Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic. It was his metaphor, not mine. But the reason he made that point was to underscore the independence of the Bank of England. So my sense of it is, and Austrians have always gone on about distortions. We don't believe in the mechanical interaction of economic aggregates. That is not where Austrian school people are. going on giving a lecture about the epistemology of the Austrian school.
Well, that's what the IEA is for, Steve. Keep going.
Well, I can do if you want. But yeah, I mean, if we look at human action, individuals make choices. They're subjective, they're time variant. And when you look at the overall performance of the economy, it is the sum of all of those individual choices. But it's Hayek's Nobel lecture, coarse economic aggregates do not act upon one another. Individuals choose and act. So the problem I think we've got, look, for example, the demand to hold cash balances. People are sitting on cash and they're likely to stay sitting on that cash for a while. Why? Because of uncertainty about the legal environment in which they're going to be living. Regime uncertainty now is a massive problem, which is partly why both the Chancellor and the Bank of England got to be so careful what they say. Why? Because they're big players. That is, they can shift markets by what they say. They have a high degree of discretion in what they do, and they are relatively insensitive to profit and loss. And that makes them very, very dangerous in a market economy. So here's to cut a long story short, here's what I really worry about with all this money sloshing about, spilling into asset markets. Still, just like back in the financial crisis, the Bank of England looks at CPI. And even when they look at CPI with housing costs, they're not looking at the purchase price of a house. They're looking at the interest payments on a mortgage or the rental costs, neither of which QE deliberately suppresses the interest payments. And so here we are. Once again, it's like Nelson holding up the telescope to his blind eye. So I stepped the Chancellor through the fiscal implications of this when he came to the Treasury Committee. But what I didn't say is one step further. Here's the problem. If inflation comes up to 5 or 6%, the Bank of England's been really clear, and the independents, the MPC with their mandate means they'll have to start tapering QE and thinking about or raising interest rates. That's likely to create a taper tantrum in the bond market, as we've seen before. I really worry we could get to a point where we can't raise the money the government is spending in the bond markets. That then will leave the Prime Minister and the Chancellor with a dread decision. Do you cut the spending, raise the taxes, or do you change the mandate of the Bank of England? At the moment, absolutely everybody's really clear, and the Chancellor reconfirmed the Bank of England will be independent and targeting price stability.
Yeah, but he hasn't been under pressure on that point.
Right,
yet,
so that's my big fear. That's my biggest fear, that when the moment, if the dread, God help us, if the dread moment comes when the bond markets won't lend the money because the Bank of England isn't there to buy the bonds back again in the secondary market, what will the Prime Minister and the Chancellor do?
Yeah, no easy choices, right? Kate, talk us through your article. You very wisely hedged your bets, right? I mean, you've been very sensible as the economics correspondent of The Spectator. You haven't fallen into the trap of making explicit forecasts. I'm going to try and push you into that trap now, though. What do you anticipate is going to happen? I mean, you point, it could be below 0%, above 4%. I mean, how useful a prediction is that? I think I was talking about the dog that didn't bark. I think I can't recall in your article, you mentioned the tiger of inflation, don't you? Is this going to come? I mean, it should have arrived by now, right? I mean, we've been rolling off money off the printing presses. What on earth is going on?
Look, if the MPC is that unsure, there's no way I'm going to give you a better prediction.
Damn you.
There's just no way I'm going to be able to do that. But I think the landscape right now is absolutely fascinating. As you say, Mark, after the financial crash, many fiscal hawks said the headline rate of inflation is going to soar, and it didn't. Now, as you pointed out, and I know Steve has spoken about this before, we did see inflation in asset prices. We actually saw quite major inflation, but that is not exactly what was predicted. And the Prime Minister's school of thought is, well, the fiscal hawks were wrong last time. They're probably wrong this time. And up until about a month ago, the economic consensus was that these incredible circumstances for borrowing are going to stay. They're here to stay. The economic rules don't apply anymore. Nobody needs to worry about this. What I have found fascinating to follow over honestly a matter of weeks is the extent to which this consensus has started to break down. So you have Larry Summers in the US, by no means a free market guy. I mean, he was Treasury Secretary to Bill Clinton, Obama's economic guru. He has been warning about hyperinflation coming from the Biden stimulus package of $1.9 trillion. Here in the UK, you don't have people making such bold assertions, but I would recommend for reading after this, Go and read Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, the speech that he's published called Tiger by the Tail just a few weeks ago. Now, his speech is named after Hayek's metaphor for inflation, which is comparing it to the tiger. Basically, once the cat's out of the bag, you can't put it back in. That's the really difficult thing about inflation is you may not see it coming, and then all of a sudden it explodes. What's fascinating is that Haldane isn't predicting major inflation, hyperinflation, but he's talking about how the circumstances are really different than they have been in the past. We just don't have a real world example of suppressing the global economy the way we have, and then it's springing back open. And we don't necessarily have the de-inflationary measures that were there before. China coming onto the world scene, the labor market becoming cheaper, globalization, goods getting cheaper. We don't necessarily have what we had before to depress inflation. And again, not making predictions, but it's interesting to see how quickly this narrative has changed. And frankly, it was a big part of the budget that we saw a few weeks ago. Everyone was talking about tax rises, like how can a Tory chancellor, a free market chancellor, be bringing in these tax rises? Well, behind those tax rises is a number 11 that is really worried about inflation, about interest rates, that if these start to move by even 1%, they're looking at having to find billions of pounds, tens of billions of pounds to pay the UK debt. So to pay off the UK bills, I should say. So, this is something that's really weighing on people's minds. I think a lot of people don't know what's going to happen, but that's why everybody's nervous, because it's really hard to predict at the moment.
Dominic, you're coining it, aren't you? You've shoved everything into Bitcoin over recent years. Remind me of that anecdote when way back in the day you were going to buy a friend of yours an ice cream with a Bitcoin, but
this was at a festival in Cornwall in it would have been 2014 or 2013. There was a very trendy hipster ice cream van, and it said accepting Bitcoin. And my friend said to me, "What's Bitcoin?" And so I explained it to him, and I got him to get his phone out, and I sent him some Bitcoins, and I said, "Go and buy some ice creams with those Bitcoins." And then he went to try and buy the ice cream, and the hipster ice cream van couldn't get a signal on his phone, so he couldn't accept the Bitcoin. So my friend ended up paying up with cash. And then fast forward to the bull market that ended in 2017 in Bitcoin, and my friend phoned me up and he said, hey, remember those Bitcoins you gave me to buy an ice cream? Well, they were on about 3 phones ago, but I found the old phone and I recovered the Bitcoins and I sold them and I bought myself a car.
so that's the right way to go. That's the right way to go.
Let me talk about inflation for a sec, Mark. We sort of touched on this already, but I just don't accept the modern economic definition of what inflation is. I was just cleaning out my father's bookshelves the other day, and I found an old Oxford English dictionary. I looked up what the definition of Bitcoin was, definition of inflation was. Excuse the Freudian slip there, quite an obvious one. The definition in the Oxford Dictionary in the early 1980s was the inflation of the money supply, the increase in the money supply, with the consequence of higher prices. That was what inflation, the original definition of inflation was. Now it's been distorted to mean something else. It just means the consumer price index. Now, the consumer price index is subject to the extraordinary deflationary pressures of globalization, Chinese cheap manufacturing costs being exported to the rest of the world, all the increased productivity of markets getting more efficient, all the increased productivity of competitiveness. That has kept consumer prices low. But because no other, like if I, in 2008...
Dominic, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, but I know Steve's got to go because there's been a division. So you've got to run, Steve. Sorry to cut you off mid-screen.
Can I just make one closing point with all this talk about spending and where we are? I'm really worried for the welfare of my constituents and the whole country. But if all this goes really badly wrong, will it be because government was too small, because taxes were too low, because we've been running surpluses for too long, because money's been too sound and interest rates been too high? And the answer is going to be no. So Conservatives have been right all along on economic policy. And if it all goes south, we're going to have to remember what we truly believe. And with that, thank you very much indeed for having me on. I've got to go and vote.
Steve, lovely to have you. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Good evening. Vote the right way, obviously. Sorry, Dominic. Let me come back to your tirade. So we're just measuring the wrong thing, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. For example, if I wanted to buy an income of 50 grand 10 years ago, that would have cost me $1 million. I could have bought £1 million worth of bonds and that would have got me an income of 50 grand. If I want an income of 50 grand now, that's going to cost me 10 million. And they're telling me there's no inflation. If I wanted to buy, a 2-3 bed house in London in the year 2000, that would have cost me £200,000. Yeah. Now it costs me £2 million. Yeah. Now the big danger is that with, the rise of protectionism, we saw a little bit of it under Trump. COVID, we're seeing more of it. This anti-China sentiment. If China's no longer able to export its deflation, then that could result in some inflation here, even in CPI. We've already got rampant inflation in financial assets. Ordinary people just use the stock market now as a savings vehicle. And, the S&P is in a bull market, the longest bull market it's ever been in history. It's simply the product of people using it as somewhere to get a yield, return on their money. We're going to see inflation in flight prices now because of COVID-19. We're seeing inflation in things like the prices of dog puppies have gone up 3 or 4 times this year. Like the price of a pint in a pub has gone up 5 or 6 times this year because, there was all the extra costs in serving a pint. You're going to have fewer customers, all the rest of it. So we will see it start to creep into CPI. But at the end of the day, CPI does not measure money supply growth, and CPI is prone to the deflationary pressures of globalization. If you want to see where the inflation is, just look at the stock market, look at the Bitcoin price. Right. How can house prices be at record highs when the economy's like it is?
Kate, is that right? Is the tiger already here, Kate? It's just that because we measure what's the price of a bag of sugar or a bowl of rice or a packet of cornflakes or a box of Persil, we haven't picked it up. But, it's actually in asset prices, or as Dominic was saying, you want to buy yourself a future income, or you want to buy yourself a flat anywhere in the UK. I mean, there's been colossal inflation. So is the tiger already on the move? It's just the way that we've traditionally measured whether the tiger there is wrong. It's already eating us alive, isn't it?
I think it's a good point, and it almost depends on who you are, how you're going to argue it. This is where the debate really is. Some people say the fiscal hawks are proven wrong, but as you say, if you're a young person trying to get on the housing ladder in the past 10 years, that has not been a very easy task because the prices continue to soar. And that first round of QE after the financial crash, I mean, it really saw asset prices go through the roof. So a lot of people have argued that QE has just been a huge gift for the rich. It turned them into the super rich and everybody else was left behind. And you saw inflation on that front. What is different about this round of QE is that rather than just basically going to balance the sheets of government, this time it's gone into the real economy. It's gone into people's pockets through furlough. It's gone out through business grants. And this is something, again, that Andy Haldane references. We just don't know what's going to happen when you treat QE differently to how you treated it before and what that could potentially do. So I'm a bit hesitant to say that it's already out of the bag because I think, things could get a lot worse. It should be noted that the governor of the Bank of England on the Today program earlier this week suggested that, an increase of 4 or 5% was not what the bank was expecting by any means. They expect inflation to head back towards the bank's target around 2% in the next few months. There is uncertainty. He underlined a lot of that uncertainty, but he did not think that a big surge in inflation was just around the corner. But the last thing I'd say, and I think this is what is so concerning and definitely what drove the budget that we saw a few weeks ago, is that we are no longer talking about hyperinflation or a surge of anything in order to put the government's finances in a really perilous state. It is estimated that if gilt yields, interest rates, and inflation all went up by 1%, I mean, we're talking very historically low standards, that would create a £25 billion fiscal hole. You double that, you triple that, sooner or later, you're talking real money. And that is what they're so terrified of. You don't need to think to go back to the 1970s, 1980s for this to become a really serious problem quite quickly. So I think that's why you saw the tax rises. The government is just trying to get in more revenue. So if it has to, if these conditions don't stay exactly as they are, they can continue to pay the bills.
Yeah, but isn't that the problem, Kate? I mean, don't you think that my worry is the government always seems to have a reason to spend more now, right? I mean, I was actually just thinking, like, you know, over the last 20 years, we had kind of 9/11. That was a crisis, you know, I mean, you know, a horrific terrorist incident, but obviously one that massively affected the world economy. Then you have the 2008 banking crash. Now you've got COVID. I mean, we're either in a crisis or emerging from a crisis, or times are good so you can keep spending. I bet the people who are saying borrow now, spend like there's no tomorrow because interest rates were low. I don't remember the same people preaching fiscal conservatism when interest rates were relatively higher.
So a few very important points here. One that I've heard the IEA's Philip Booth make from time to time, which is this idea that a crisis comes along every once in a while, and then you mend the roof while the sun is shining, and all that has really gone out the window these past few decades. Because as you say, Mark, it has been a crisis after a crisis, and all of a sudden it does seem more common. But I think this is where you're really getting tensions now between number 10 and number 11's thinking, is how much money can we keep spending? Because don't forget, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor planned to increase spending before the COVID crisis hit. They were going to they added £30 billion into their spending spree back in March 2020. And that was, not all of that was for COVID. I think the majority of that was actually for non-COVID things. The Prime Minister has not met a spending project that he doesn't like, nor has he met a bit of public spending that he's willing to kill. He told the Spectator, I think it was 2 Julys ago, right when he became leader, that he thought that austerity in terms of public spending had been a mistake. As you say, Mark, like, something's got to give. So you can have sympathy, I think, and maybe I've been criticized for being too sympathetic on this front. I think you can have sympathy for choosing to raise taxes, making the hard choice to say, we need to make sure that we have our finances in order. But what you can't then do is turn around and go on an additional spending spree. You actually have to put that money towards tackling the deficit. And so, you know, we'll see over the next few years if they do that, or if they decide they're just going to keep spending.
And do you think that it's incumbent upon folk like the IEA, Kate, to turn their attention again to the deficit and the debt? And, you know, are we in danger of actually being a bit too dovish, saying don't tackle this at the moment? We've had a pandemic, we've had a national crisis. Isn't the danger that once people's eyes are completely off that ball, and maybe I'm guilty of this myself in sort of saying we don't need to pay everything back now, that's just a license to just, for everything, you know, give everybody a pay rise, spend more on this, you know, build a railway to the moon, whatever else they, you know, whatever other crazy ideas they might have.
Boris Johnson, if you gave him that idea, he might run with it. Look, I think it's all in context. It is right to say that during a pandemic, you spend what you have to spend to keep people safe. And it is right to treat it as wartime spending. It seems economists from the left and the right, you know, really have agreed that that has been the right thing to do. Yeah. The problem is when that starts to morph into day-to-day spending. And we're seeing that. It's going to be on the National Health Service. It's going to be on education. It's going to be on welfare. There's, you know, we're going to start to turn COVID spending into real day-to-day spending for the foreseeable future. And you can do that, but you have to say where that money is coming from. You have to say how you're going to fund it. What are you cutting? What taxes are you increasing? What parts of the economy do you plan to grow to get more revenue in? And that's where I think the focus needs to be, not on criticizing the COVID spending. Like, much of that was very legitimate and important, but making sure that in 5 years' time, we haven't decided that that's how we're going to live our lives.
Dominic, let me give the last word to you. I mean, in the very long run, obviously we're all dead. But you know, if you keep spending money like there's no tomorrow, eventually there won't be. But spending that's not sustainable ultimately won't be sustained, right? There will be a correction, because you can't completely square this circle. I mean, you're better to try and square the circle before things get completely out of control. But do you think there will be a kind of reversion to the norm at some point? This, well, you know, we're at the taxable limits of the economy, but we want to spend more than that. And, you know, let's borrow a whole load of money because interest rates are low, and let's just sort of cross our fingers they stay low. It's going to unwind and get back to normality at some point, isn't it?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Boris is by instinct a particularly prudent man. We saw from his time when he was mayor, he likes a public spend. He likes, you know, to some kind of public infrastructure spend with his name on it. And I don't think we will see any kind of reigning in a couple of years' time. There's going to be an election to win, so there's going to be more spending going on to win that. I just think it's just the nature of government. It just grows and keeps on growing. And now we've got this new thing called MMT, and Boris Johnson, he mocked Jeremy Corbyn he called it an MMF, a magic money forest, what Corbyn's spending plans were. But all those left-wing ideas of MMT have all made their way in the Conservative Party, and they are the means by which the Conservative Party is going to maintain its spending. I think one of the real dangers, I'm quite relieved actually that he didn't put taxes up by as much as they sort of scared us into thinking he was going to put them up by, but nevertheless, there were no tax cuts. I think there's two things to think about. Real inflation could make its way into CPI via a rising oil price. And because of all the various regulations that have gone in, all green energy and so on, there hasn't been a great deal of spending on oil, particularly on oil exploration, oil production. And just secretly, you think the oil price went to -30 last March. It was over $70 Brent oil last week. It's in a bull market. It's creeping up. If oil goes over $100, that's going to start hurting people. There's a scenario that we Bitcoiners talk about where inflation might not show up in official numbers, even if it shows up in real life, as we've been talking about. But they talk about a scenario called hyper-Bitcoinization, which is everyone rushing into Bitcoin to escape fiat money. And already what you're seeing now is I can lend out Bitcoins at 6%, and I can borrow fiat at 1 or 2%. So Pete, there's a huge trade now. It's like the yen carry trade, but into Bitcoin, of people borrowing Bitcoin at fiat at 1 or 2% and lending in Bitcoin at 6%. And, the more of this you see in people earning in fiat and wherever they can, translating it into crypto and saving in crypto. And once you see hyper-Bitcoinization, that's what triggers the problems in fiat. I think, I'm not predicting the end of currency, but I just think we carry on with this continued steady erosion in the purchasing power of money for many, many, many years ahead.
Well, Kate and Dominic, on your slightly downbeat note, your downplayed notes there, thank you very much for joining us. Dominic, all that money you're making, don't buy yourself an ice cream, sit on it, and then buy yourself a Ferrari next year, right?
Unlike Boris, I'm delaying my gratification, Mark.
Yeah, that's the way to go. Kate, lovely to have you on the program again. Lovely to see you. Dominic, great to see you again, my friend. Thanks both for joining us. My thanks to Calvin and for Steve for joining us earlier on the program. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed the program, please give the thumbs up on YouTube. Please leave a comment. We'll try and read all of those. If you haven't yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. Live with Littlewood isn't back next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Next Wednesday, I'll be having a conversation with Richard Tice, the new leader of Reform UK, about his plans and proposals. The previous day, I'll be having an in-conversation with Jim Mellon, the businessman. So please hit the notification bell and you'll be reminded about the two of those. And this Thursday on the IEA YouTube channel as well, we have an event on Thursday lunchtime on harm reduction or humbug. Go to iea.org.uk to find out more about that. Thanks all for watching. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, give us money in Bitcoin, dollars, sterling, whatever you can spare. Go to the donate page on the IEA website. Been great to speak to you all. Thanks for following us. Have a great evening. Over and out.